Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. Alice McDermott is our guest. She'll be talking with me about her wonderful new book called Absolution. This became an instant bestseller. It tells the stories of the American wives brought to Southeast Asia by their husbands and what it meant to live on the margins of the Vietnam War. Anne Patchett called this book one of the finest contemporary novels she had read. One critic described it as Alice McDermott's masterpiece, which is truly saying something. Alice McDermott is the author of 9 novels, including The Ninth Hour, Someone, and Charming Billy, which won the award for the National Book Award in 1998. And now, let me welcome Alice McDermott. Alice, it's great to see you again.
Wonderful to see you, Diane. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for doing this book club for all these years, and thank you for inviting me to it.
Well, I'm delighted to have you with us. I can't tell you how many people have said, how did she understand what happened in Vietnam at that time? Were you ever in Vietnam, Alice?
Not physically. um, of course, I came of age at a time when the Vietnam War was very much on all our mind. Part of my teenage years, my college years, and aftermath. So certainly, and as an English major and a reader and a writer, I had immersed myself for decades in the fabulous literature that came out of that war. But when I realized I was going to be setting a novel in Saigon in 1963, I did think this would be my opportunity to visit Vietnam. But then COVID came along, and I had the choice to either put the book aside until we could travel again, or imagine the place. And when I knew that the burden would be on my imagination, I immediately went back to the fiction that I loved that had already taken me to Vietnam. Saigon in 1963 is not a place any of us can travel to. And the novel is really a recollection. It's a memory piece in so many ways. So I knew it had to be my character's recollection of that time and place. And my own journalistic investigations would probably not be of much help. I really needed to know what the characters recalled.
So does that mean you spoke with people who had been there during that time?
Inadvertently, I did. Long before I wrote the first sentence. You and I both know, living inside the Beltway and all kinds of social situations, you run into the most fascinating women. Over the years, many times I would, at cocktail parties and carpool lines and volunteering at church or at the library, find myself in conversations with women who did come of age in the 50s and the 60s and were either military wives or State Department secretaries. And they would, with prompting, they would never brag about their own experience. As a matter of fact, it was always very humble. I was just a mother and a wife. I was taking care of the household as my husband was doing these interesting things. So inadvertently, I had had conversations with many such women. But once I started composing the novel, I didn't do any interviews. I wanted the story to be very much a part of these characters who were coming to life as I was writing sentence by sentence.
And here is one of the first questions we got from Sarah, who says, I grew up as an Army brat and was an Army spouse for 26 years. I've known many women who are like your fictional characters in Absolution. Your portrayal of military lifestyle from a female's perspective is on spot. How did you do your research? And she says, I laughed out loud several times while reading Absolution. Unexpected humor in your writing was a great surprise. So you see, everybody thinks somehow you were there.
Well, it's always nice to be reassured that you got it right. Of course, we want. I write realistic fiction, so to speak, and so the accuracy is very important. But I'm also a great proponent. I guess I wouldn't have written 9 novels if I hadn't been, of the power of imagination, the power of fellow feeling. So yes, there was, again, as I was saying, my first real research was to go back and read the Vietnam novels that I loved. One of which, Graham Greene's The Quiet American, in many ways spurred this novel because as prescient as Graham Greene was in 1955 when he published The Quiet American about what a catastrophe America's involvement in Southeast Asia was going to be, his portrait of the women in the novel is just horrible. He did not see the women's movement coming. He saw the political failures, but he did not see that his own failure as a male novelist in not acknowledging that the women in the novel might be interesting and complex. I remember being 19 years old and reading that novel for the first time and thinking, yeah, he got one part right, but he sure didn't get the second part right. So I suppose, my intention to give voice to such women started a very long time ago.
You even went so far as to remind me, and I laughed out loud, of garter belts and pull-on stockings. And I mean, I just laughed because we all wore those, whether we were here in the United States or in Vietnam, where I must say, those stockings, those girdles had to be awfully warm.
I actually had a young reader ask if I had just made that up, or if women actually did still wear stockings when it was 101 degrees in Saigon. But that's the whole, I think this is what I love about novels, and what I go to novels for. It's not just to rehearse what we already know, but it is to see characters in their entire context. You know, to say a 23-year-old unexperienced woman should not have been complicit in the politics of the United States in Vietnam in 1963, to blame the past without saying, yes, but this was a woman who was wearing a girdle, when it was 101 degrees and had to spray her hair, and had all these strictures on her life and her way of seeing the world. I think that's what we go to fiction for, to be reminded of the context of any human life.
Let's talk about Trisha. She has recently been married. Her early months of marriage are so happy and so exciting. I don't think she really realizes what her husband does. I mean, she is simply trusting of him as she was trusting of her father and went to Saigon with him, never imagining that he might have been part of the CIA, planning this whole mess that's about to begin. And she just seems so naive, and it made me wonder whether I was that naive in those years, as contrasted with Charlene, the woman who sort of takes Trisha under her wing. Charlene looks as though she could have become a corporate head back in 1953, 1963.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. Diane, I don't think you ever were that naive. I cannot believe it. But yes, a woman like Trisha, a somewhat sheltered Catholic education, the child of immigrants, working class immigrants, the only child of older parents, in that time and place. Just as you were talking about, I recalled I was down at the Carter Library to give a reading from Absolution, and the wonderful curator there told me the story of that Rosalind had told about Jimmy walking out of their bedroom one day in a suit. And she said, "Did somebody die? Are you going to a funeral?" And he said, "No, I'm running for governor."
He had never told her.
Yes, exactly. You know, and so that sense of, I don't think it's easy from this perspective to see that as mean-spirited. But I think we need to expand our sense of the past by understanding in the full context. Trisha's husband, for instance, also a working class kid from Yonkers, who sees, who is a smart guy and joins the Navy, goes to undergrad on the GI Bill, goes to law school. He is climbing into the upper classes from a working class background, and he is a devout Catholic. He believes that communism must be stopped, that it will threaten the very way of life. He believes that the Blessed Mother appeared in a field in Portugal to say communism must be stopped, Russia must be converted. So at that time and place, to have that understanding, which was something I had to work on myself as the author, not to see him as a villain, not to see him as nefarious in what he's doing in Saigon, despite the results of it, but to try to understand the complex motivation, personal and political and religious, that may have driven the men who were in charge and were out to do good, they thought, or they believed, despite the results that we now understand.
And tell me about the differences you created between Trisha and her friend, Charlene. Charlene seems to be very outgoing. She is precisely the opposite of shy Trisha. And she seems to know everything that's going on. She has no doubt about why she and her husband are there. And yet, in some ways, she's trying to make up for that almost in advance of the disastrous end to which all the people of Saigon will come.
Yes, yeah. You know, for Charlene, she is a Peter, Trisha's wife, calls her a dynamo, you know, and in the parlance of those years, a woman such as this would have, and it's not really a compliment, she's a dynamo. But she's in some ways, she sees Trisha wants to be the ideal wife and mother. The helpmeet is the word that her father uses on the day she's married. Be a helpmeet to your husband. And that is Trisha's ambition. Charlene also fills that role. She's a corporate wife, but she also wants to affect the greater world. She wants to do good. One of the first things she tells Trisha, and I think of it as the heart of the dilemma of her character. She says, I want to do good, but it takes money. And so her intentions are to ease the suffering of the world. Impossible, right? She thinks she can do it. But on the other hand, she understands that that ambition is complex and may lead to some, let us say, underhanded dealings in order to raise the money that she feels she can use to do good. So it's that woman's dilemma. Do you go out into the world and try to change it, or do you hunker down and take care of the people who need you the most? Your husband, your father, your family.
And this is where you bring Barbie into the picture. How clever of you, Alice. At a time when, I mean, you probably didn't even know when you were writing this book that Barbie was going to be in every movie theater in the country.
Not at all. No. You know, when I was sort of searching around for a way into this story of these women on the periphery, as you said, of this disaster and any big historical events, I was having a conversation at a cocktail gathering, just as you do, chit chat, and a woman, a friend of mine, who had been in Saigon as a young wife in the early 60s, just mentioned casually that she and her friends would pick up the scraps after their dressmakers left and sew Barbie doll clothes. Huh. And when she said that, again, I wasn't doing research, we were just chatting, social life. I had a memory that I had completely forgotten about of being a kid on Long Island and being sent by my mother. I don't know why, probably my mother was trying to do good, to go play with a little girl who I wasn't really friends with, to bring my Barbie and go play with her. I don't remember who this girl was. I don't know why I was sent, but I do recall that this little girl had a Barbie doll dressed in what I now know is an ao dai, the Vietnamese traditional dress. I didn't ask her where she got it. I don't know how she got it. This would have been the early 60s. Someone may have sent it to her. I do remember I wanted one. I was very jealous.
Describe. I looked that word up and looked to a designer who makes these clothes here in the United States. And of course, they're absolutely beautiful. But that traditional design with the long outer skirt and the opening on the side, is that what you pictured?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, I have a very clear memory of this little stiff Barbie doll with, I guess, the long overdress with the slit and then the pants, very elegant, very simple.
So elegant.
Just beautiful. Yeah. And you know, for the ones in the novel to be made of silk, that elegance. So those two things happening in this just you know, inside the Beltway conversation with somebody who had been in Saigon, I thought, all right, I need to write an origin story for a Barbie doll dressed in an ao dai in the early 1960s on the precipice of the Vietnam War, before everything. I mean, 63, as you well know, is an amazing year in the history of the world, not just of our country. We all think of JFK's assassination, and of course the president of Vietnam 3 weeks before that was assassinated. But Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963. We were on the verge of the women's movement. The March on Washington, Medgar Evers was assassinated in 1963.
Wow.
Pope John the 23rd, which is very relevant for my characters, died in 63 after all the changes of Vatican II. It's an amazing year, and it really is a year on the precipice of what we might call the modern age.
You know, the title of your book, Absolution, it says, though, every single person, with the exception of 2, deserves, needs absolution. And the 2 exceptions would be Dom and his young son, who I assume is fated to have Down syndrome. And I was so touched by the 2 of them. I thought, well, they are the 2 who are outside. They are the 2 who represent the best of human beings.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm so glad that that affected you, because in some ways that portrait probably drove the novel more than anything else. That sense of, again, from my living in outside Washington, how many times I've gone down to the Vietnam Wall. Whenever we have visitors, we take them. My husband and I always went down on the morning of Memorial Day. We always took our kids. And you walk along the wall, and it really is like entering a cathedral. It doesn't matter how crazy everything is on the mall that day, the motorcycles, all that. When you walk along, there's a kind of cathedral hush, and you have that sense as the wall gets higher and then comes down, and all those names. And I don't know if it's my imagination, but I think it's accurate. There's a sense when you get to the end of it of a refrain of what for. You hear it from other people, you think it yourself. It's overwhelming. All these lives, all these names, all these mostly young men. What for? What was it for? We look back from the 21st century and say, what did we? And there has to be a response to that question. Not an answer, but a response. And my sense has always been, again, because of my own faith, from the Gospel of John, there's no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends. So forget the politics, forget the disaster of America's involvement, and make sense of each and every name. And the only way you can respond to the helplessness of what for is to say they laid down their life in love. They laid down their life for their friends. So Dom, being a GI in Vietnam in the early 60s, living a long and good life, lays down his life for his son. And I think there's another 2 characters who also have that sense of goodness, and that would be Lee.
Lily.
Yes, Lily, the Americanized Charlene name, but Lee. At the very end of the, she, out of love for her cousin, she returns to the leper colony to be with her, knowing, it's futile, there's no cure, and putting her own life at risk, but out of sheer love. So I think those are the 2 good characters.
Yes.
Not that they aren't complex, but
yes.
but ultimately we have to say it was worth something. Our experience is worth something. Even if history tells us it was disastrous, the individual's life is worth something. So I felt very strongly that there should be at least two characters who are, in some ways, they're inconsequential good, which is how Charlene's daughter refers to her mother's efforts. Inconsequential, has a consequence in sort of a broader sense.
Did you have the title before you began the book?
No, I didn't. And that, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to get the whole book. It was something that I realized there's this call and response. There's Trisha's story recollecting her time as a young wife. And then there's Rainey, Charlene's daughter, who's asked the question of Trisha and her recalling sort of the years after, post-Vietnam. And I realized that there was a kind of, again, this is, my Catholic bias, a kind of confession going on between these two women in their recollections. And so slowly I began to realize that they're seeking something. They are seeking some kind of absolution for themselves, for their times, for their husbands, the lives that they've led. So here's a funny story. So I had a dear friend, a Monsignor from the Brooklyn Diocese, brilliant guy, studied literature at Columbia, well into his 90s. I was having dinner with him as I was composing the novel, and he said, "Do you have a title?" And I thought, here's the guy to ask. So I said, "Well, I'm thinking of calling it Absolution." And Monsignor George looked at me. He was this big guy, and he said, "That's a terrible title." I thought, why? And he said, because nobody understands what it means.
Huh.
So people think it's a get out of jail free card. People think, oh, you got absolution. It's like as if it never happened. But that's not what it is. And he went into a lovely exegesis about how active it is. But then he said the most essential thing. He said, the Latin root of absolution can be translated as to set free. And he said, that always involves two actors. It cannot be done alone. There is the one who is set free and the one who sets free. And by that time, I understood, as you've already pointed out, that there's lots of twinning in this novel. Yes. Everybody seems to have a mirror image or an opposite image. And I was sort of intuitively seeing that develop, but I don't know that I fully understood how it worked until Monsignor George told me that. And I said, yes, it's the most human of interactions because it absolutely is dependent on two. That there has to be something on both sides. The one who forgives and the one who seeks forgiveness. So as soon as he said that, I said, I'm sorry, you just convinced me it's the best title. And Monsignor George said, of course, you're absolved.
That's a great story. Alice, one of the books that we had on the book club recently was Abraham Verghese' Covenant of Water.
Beautiful book.
Beautiful book in which leprosy plays a major role. Mm-hmm. And I did not know that. I should have, because they both take place in Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. And leprosy still exists in this world. But I wondered why you wanted to bring that particular disease into the book.
Yeah, a number of reasons. I mean, I understood that for Trisha and Charlene, these two, sort of safe space wives, they're living in an American community in Saigon, but Charlene's ambition will not keep her there. I knew that she would, and maybe it was just because I was writing about Southeast Asia and the war. I was also thinking of Heart of Darkness, and so I knew that these two women would have to have a journey of some sort. So I knew Charlene would bring Trisha out of that safe space, the Americans in their cosseted world, um, and and it would be for something impossible. Charlene wants to end suffering, so there's that sense that nothing is impossible for her. She's determined that she will not look away from suffering. So leprosy with all its myths, actually, that to do that, you are putting yourself at risk. When I was writing The Ninth Hour, my last novel, very much about women who put themselves at risk, religious women, uh, I was trying to found my own religious order, fictional religious order. So I was reading a lot of histories of religious orders, and I read about Sister Mary Ann Cope, who was the nun who brought 6 sisters from Syracuse, New York, to Molokai to work with the lepers, and gave her life to the lepers. And one of the things I discovered doing that research that I just loved was that Sister Mary Ann, when she got to Hawaii, thought it was very important that the leper women had beautiful clothes.
Huh.
She had a wonderful fashion sense, even though she was a nun. So I didn't use that really in the Ninth Hour, but when I was thinking about Charlene and her ambition, she loves beautiful clothes and she wants to do good. So her spontaneous decision that she's going to bring these beautiful outfits, the adult size of what the Barbie doll is wearing, to lepers, to show them, in her mind, that they are loved, that they are cared for, that the healthy among us will not look away from them.
And yet Charlene is the one who labels her neighboring wives, some of them as clothes horses.
Yes.
And it's the last thing she would want to have herself as described, even though she has a closet full of gorgeous clothes, handmade by those artistic, gloriously hand-stitched, beautiful clothing made by Lily, who finally does team up with her cousin, yes, who does have leprosy. There is an example of the almost two-faced attitude toward the Vietnam and even toward the children themselves. It's a couple of paragraphs that begin on page 39 in the middle of the page. Would you read that for us?
Thank you, Diane. I'm happy to. Yes. This takes place. Peter is Trisha's husband. They've only recently, just in the last few days, arrived in Saigon. She's never traveled anywhere outside of New York. And they have visited the Central Market, and she had to leave. She's overwhelmed. And this takes place. In the glare of the street, now I felt the throb of sunlight on my throbbing neck. A little girl suddenly stepped in front of me, a palm extended. I had by then lost Peter's hand. I saw her as if through the sound and tumult of shattering glass. Her hair was a tangle, her shirt worn thin as a fly's wing. She was solemn, almost indifferent, but so solidly before me, I felt she was soldered to the ground. I bent toward her. It was instinctual. And then she blinked slowly in that lovely way children have. The dirt in the creases of the palm she lifted toward me might have been an indication of her blighted future, her aborted lifeline. I would have been something less than human if I'd been able to push that little hand away. And so I bent, took her hand between my own. It was like cupping a small bird. She seemed too surprised to pull away. Here, I said. I reached into the pocket of my skirt. Peter had suggested I not bring a purse, and found an American dime, put it in her hand. In an instant, I was surrounded, a sudden onslaught of little bodies, clamorous voices, a tangle of upturned palms, each one as dirty as the little girl's. She was immediately lost to me in this battering, either pushed aside or turned away. The children were crying out, plucking at my clothes, pushing, grasping. As I straightened from my crouch, I felt them bumping against me, softly, insistently, touching, poking my back, my shoulders, my hair. I might have been swimming up through a clutch of small limbs, some blasted, shipwrecked schoolyard. I heard Peter call out and then felt his hand under my arm. He pulled me forward, but the children followed us. He began to swat at them, shouting objections in Vietnamese until we reached the end of the block and stumbled out into the street where there were two traffic police, white mice, who waved their batons and spoke sharply until the children dispersed. We walked a few blocks, Peter holding my arm as if we were still being pursued. Finally, he turned and said, no, shouted, "Did you give them money?" Them. Decades later, I hear the word again and know something of what was contained in it, ordinary as it seemed at the time.
Just a vivid portrait of the lines between us and them.
Yes. Yeah.
And I have a question here from Julie, who says the scene that will stay with me forever is when Trisha and Charlene are in the orphanage, and the girl who has been burned by napalm is standing and crying in the crib. How important was it to you that these visceral moments punctuate this soul-smacking novel?
You know, I guess I'd let Charlene speak to me. It's that we can't turn away. We can't turn away from suffering. Not that we have the answer for it. You know, when someone says what for, we can't explain away that there is no good what for, but we can say, here's a response. So for Charlene, it's the response is do what you can. You know, inconsequential good, her daughter called it, but is that better than nothing? You know, so yes, to face it, to face suffering that in some ways we're all heir to, that we cannot avoid, um, and very important for these two women, and I think this is why we need women's voices telling their side of the history, is the focus on children, on the suffering of children, on the suffering of the innocents. Later in the novel, Dom recounts a scene that he recalls of Charlene holding a child as the child takes its last breath in an orphanage. And Dom tells Charlene's daughter that Charlene looks up and says, "This is unacceptable," which is ridiculous, which is a crazy, sort of a mad thing to say. This is life. But for her, this is unacceptable. She faces it, and wants to reject it, but of course we all know you can't. But it's children. It's you know, think what an impossible dream it is, but to think if as humankind we said children cannot be made to suffer. That's the first rule. We have to do everything we can so that children are not made to suffer. Think what that would mean to how we deal with the border, what's going on in Gaza, what went on in Vietnam. Of course, we don't say that. Collateral damage is acceptable. But these two women, at least Charlene and Trisha wants to believe it as well, say, no, we're drawing the line there. No, this is unacceptable.
You know, it's so interesting that you bring that up because we are in the midst of Alabama's ruling about those embryos and the fact that Alabama has decided that they are living human beings.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, as a Roman Catholic, react to that in light of the suffering that does go on among children such as those in Saigon or even in this country who've been abandoned, who've been left on doorsteps?
Exactly.
How do you react?
Yeah, I mean, it's a ruling such as that is not about ending suffering. It's not about cruelty. There's no suffering involved. It's about controlling women. It's about controlling the lives, the bodies, the choices of women. And you're right. And the great irony is this is a state who doesn't want to pass gun control. This is a red state. Let's face it. So it's the hypocrisy is quite startling. Can you imagine the Alabama Supreme Court saying no citizen of Alabama can participate in any military action that causes the death of children? We're making a law. You're going to have to leave the state if you want to participate in a military action that will cause the death of children. Then I would have some respect for what they're trying to do.
And speaking of children, Trisha has at least one, if not more, miscarriages. She wants desperately to have a child. Peter is from a family of 9 children. He says, it doesn't bother me if we don't have children. But Charlene, toward the end of Absolution, arranges for a child, a beautiful, lovely Vietnamese child, no more than 3 or 4 months old, with a scar born to her. Charlene places this child in Trisha's hands and says, she's yours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Trisha takes her home and then is surrounded by the little child's family, who are all in tears. Is Trisha one of those who receives absolution for giving that child back?
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yes.
It's complicated, emotional and practical. situation. You know, Trisha says it herself. Charlene places in her arms her heart's desire. Trisha says, I have no doubt about how much I will love this child. But then when the other children come and
in tears
and ask to have their sister, no one knows if she's really their sister, but in tears, the question of suffering comes up again. And Trisha has in her hand the thing that she most wants, and then is confronted with at what price. I think when she gives the child back to these children, it's not out of, and this is maybe the very thing that she needs absolution for. It's not out of goodness. It's out of anger. She feels that she has been manipulated. She's been manipulated by Charlene. She's been manipulated by her husband, who doesn't tell her that they're going to be leaving Saigon, that he's quitting. That for the first time in her life, she realizes, I need to claim my own life and my own decisions. So in some ways, she works against her own heart's desires, which I think happens a lot with people who are oppressed. They strike out and often not in their own best interest. So, you know, this was maybe not the best time for her to say, I'm not going to be manipulated, because the people who are manipulating her, Charlene, just gave her what she wanted. So I think that's where perhaps she didn't say, oh, this is better for the child. She said selfishly, I'm giving this child back because I'm tired of people telling me what to do, how to do things. You know, Charlene just says, here she is, this is what you want, I've taken care of it. And Min Lin, who is the housekeeper, is also part of it. She's telling, you know, Trisha, no, you have to take this child. Don't listen. So it's that, again, people who feel that they don't have agency, as we say, often, and I think we see that in our politics today, often will act against their own best interest in order to claim some kind of power that they feel they've lost.
How much of that informal adoption of young Vietnam children actually went on? That's a question from Barbara.
Yes, you know, from the reading that I've done, especially the more contemporaneous reports, especially at this time, there was quite a bit of it. And it was easy enough. It wasn't so much black market. It was easy enough to tie yourself, someone like Charlene, who's a church lady, you know, to get whatever paperwork you needed through various organizations. Not a lot of vetting going on. There was a sense that this is the best thing to do. I mean, there's a point in the novel when Rainey, Charlene's daughter, talks about Operation Baby Lift, which was historically actually something that happened towards the end of the war, when Vietnamese orphans were being piled onto planes and flown out of the country. One of those planes crashed tragically because they were being fired upon. So there was this sense, this American sense, and again, it's a complicated, it's not heroes and villains. Yes, give these children better lives. There's a conversation that Charlene has with the wife of a major who's very sure of herself. And she says, why are you bringing lollipops to hospitals? These kids, the only thing you can do for these kids is get them out of this poor country, bring them to the United States where they'll have a good life. That's all you can do. The rest is nonsense. So there was a strong belief that this was the right thing to do.
One of our listeners wants to know, has Mattel reached out to you? And what was their response to this book?
Oh, I don't think Mattel knows anything about it just yet.
I'll bet they will. I'll bet they will.
I have to say, you know, I began this novel way before the Barbie movie probably was even written itself. But it is amusing. Again, when we think back to how astonishing it seems to that women wore stockings and girdles in in 101 degrees. I did get a big kick out of looking back at Barbies and how they were sold in the early 60s, and to find that there was an outfit called Plantation Belle.
Well, I was about to say the connection between U.S. history with slavery and in Saigon,
Yes.
the use of Saigonese women, Vietnamese women. I mean, I wonder whether it ever occurred to any of those women who would simply assume the cook was going to put dinner on the table or prepare a new dress for that evening. I wonder if they'd put those things together.
Yeah, well, Trisha has a precursor to her friendship with Charlene that she talks about in the novel. She has a social justice warrior friend from her all-girl Catholic college, Stella, who actually, and again, to be an American is a complicated thing. Stella's mother is from Louisiana and has ancestors who were slave owners. Stella's father is the child of immigrants. He is Polish, Italian, and Irish American. And they live up, again, they end up working class. He's a fireman. She thought she was going to come to the New York to be a model. So Stella feels a personal sense that she must in some way provide recompense for her own family's involvement in the slave trade. And she sees that, again, this is in the early 60s. She sees that as working with Dorothy Day in the city, protesting the nuclear bomb, and also going to Birmingham to help register voters. And she tries to, well, she partially drags Trisha along with her. So there's that, again, that complicated notion of generational guilt and the echo, and how it comes up to a kind of innocence as well. You know, can you be, such as the women like Trisha and even like Charlene, can you be called complicit when you really have no power yourself? You know, when you are fulfilling the obligation that you feel has been handed to you, and that is to be a helpmeet to your spouse, to have a happy home, to raise the children. Can you then be complicit in whatever culture you find yourself in when you've been convinced that your obligation is to the home front, to the people who need you and love you more than any other?
Finally, Alice, the structure of this book and the reaching out on the part of Rainey to Trisha, because her mother, Charlene, has died. She's gone through lots of books and boxes and come upon Trisha's name. And the two tell their own versions. not only Charlene, but life there.
Yes.
Was that your initial way of telling the story, or did you come upon it?
I think I knew intuitively. And again, this goes back to you don't have to do research, you just have to listen at cocktail parties. I think I understood intuitively about women of this generation who've had these experiences, who were helpmeets to their husbands and spouses, that they would have to be invited to tell their stories. I knew that from my own experience. They were not, Trisha and many women like her are not the sort to grab someone by the collar and say, let me tell you how interesting my life was. They're the type to say, I just took care of the house, I hosted the parties, I took care of the children, I did fundraisers for the school, I had my little charities, but my husband was doing the important thing. So I knew Trisha had to be invited to tell her story. And once she was invited, I knew Rainey would then, again, a call and response, a confessional, would then have to fill her in on both Charlene's life since they separated and really what's happened to us, that is Americans. Rainey's life has been a life of disquiet, and I think that's her inheritance from her father and her mother.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yes.
Alice McDermott, I cannot thank you enough for being with us today. This is such a beautiful novel. I hope everyone all over the world reads it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.